Hello students, welcome back after the midterm, and this is Module 10. We will be covering Chapter 8 of the Adams and Lawrence textbook in this module, entitled Examining Causal Relationships Among Your Variables, Introduction to Experimental Design. The chapter opens with this letter to the editor that was received in Indiana, and what they do with this figure 8.1 is they introduce the idea of this misunderstanding between cause and effect. And so what this refers to in the idea that the letter was written telling the Department of Transportation that they needed to move the deer crossing sign to a less busy road is that they didn't understand the sequence of causality as to what was causing deers to be hit by cars. There are three criteria for causality. One is correlation. You have to show a correlation first and foremost. And that's what we've focused on in previous chapters up at this point in time, is that once we know there's a correlation, then we can start and investigate further into the criteria for causality. The sequence is next in importance. You have to show that variable A occurs before variable B in order to show the sequence of one causing the other. If they occur at the same time, then one didn't cause the other, something else caused both. And the other one is that there has to be no other alternative explanation, so you have to look at other variables and eliminate them as potential causes. Because if you can't eliminate all of the other variables as potential causes, then you still don't know if variable A is the cause, because something in variable B, C, D, E, or F may also be causing it, and then you have confounding variables, which you'll understand in here. So testing cause and effect is a practice exercise which I want you to do when you're reading through the textbook. I want you to read the instructions for practice 8.1. Do the exercise. You can look in the back. I really don't care if you do this like a test. You can read the instructions here on practice 8.1 and then go to the back and read the answer. And if it makes sense to you, then go on. You can carry on and doing your reading. If it doesn't make sense to you, then you need to go back and do more in-depth reading. And that's how I use these practice exercises, just to see if my brain has wrapped itself around the idea that is trying to be explained through the textbook, and that's what these practice exercises are good for. So on practice 8.1, what I want you to look at is the way they answered the question, to see if you would have answered it the same way. Did you catch on to the idea that one had to precede the other? Did you rule out multiple other explanations? And then, do you still understand that this is not to say that pedestrians talking or texting on the phone or listening to music is not dangerous or has not increased the pedestrian fatality rate, only that with this limited information the causal relationship has not been demonstrated. And so that's how I want you to look at these practice exercises from now on to the end of the semester. These chapters that we're going to cover now, from chapter 8 all the way through to chapter 14, we're going to cover them fairly quickly. We don't need to get into depth at this point in time. These are chapters where there are certain things which may be beneficial to you, and I want you to read the text in context of how is this going to benefit my career, my interests, where my passions lie, where I'm thinking my career may go. Will I need this information? And so there's a lot of information in here that's not going to show up on the final exam. It's not going to be part of your research project, and you can breeze through those sections fairly quickly unless I tell you otherwise in the videos. And so that's how I want you to do these practice exercises. Your focus now for the second half of the semester is going to be on your research project, not on reading chapters 8 to 14. But I want you to spend enough time reading chapters 8 to 14 that you find things that may be really specific to your career and beneficial to you. Because at this point the areas of research become very, very broad. And your careers aren't going to be that broad. So I want you to apply this to your life and to your interests and where you think your career may take you, and then pull that information out of the text. So ruling out alternative explanations, internal validity is what you're after here. Now remember, internal validity increases at the expense of external validity. So internal validity is the extent to which you can rule out alternative explanations for causality. And a confounding variable is a variable that varies systematically with the variables of interest in a study and is a potential alternative explanation for causality. Threats to internal validity can come from two very distinct sources. This slide here represents 4 sources that come due to experiences or environmental factors, history, where any event or environmental condition other than variable A caused the change in variable B, maturation, which comes from the change in variable B was due to natural changes that occur over time, testing, where observed changes in variable B were due to previous exposure to a test, and instrumentation, observed changes in variable B were due to inconsistency in the measurement instrument, administrators, or scores. Threats to internal validity that are due to participant characteristics are very different from those previous four. And I want you to read through and understand these while you're in the textbook and make sure that you understand them. And these are the 8 major points which I want you to take from this chapter here is these 8 threats to internal validity are the most important thing out of chapter 8. Group design, as it relates to the first 4, history, maturation, testing, and instrumentation, improving group design is how you can overcome and minimize these 4 threats. If everything except a variable A is kept constant across all the groups, then all the threats due to experiences or environmental factors can be controlled or eliminated. However, many participant characteristics may still threaten the internal validity of group designs, and this is where the other 3 of the other 4 factors come in. Factors such as attrition, selection interactions. As it relates to a quasi-experimental design, this is a design in which a researcher compares naturally occurring or pre-existing groups that are exposed to different levels of variable A. Internal validity is at risk to threats due to participant characteristics. This is where we get to a section of the textbook, and you're going to see this a lot more now in my videos, and I'm going to mark off pages that you don't need to read. When I say you don't need to read them, you don't need to read them for my benefit. You don't need to read them as part of this curriculum and part of the syllabus. But you may want to read them because of something that you do at work or you may do in your career. So don't not read them, just really scan through them really quickly for something that may be of benefit to you. So on here, these pages 273 to 278, those are 5 pages that you do not need to read for for this course, but you may want to just look through them. Once again, this figure here comes from pages 273 to 278, so don't spend any time on figure 8.3 or understanding it, and don't spend any time on practice 8.2 unless you want to for your own benefit. Okay, how an experiment can demonstrate causality. So this is the experimental design part of chapter 8. First, you want to address the criteria of correlation and sequence. So you want to design an experiment where you can manipulate an independent variable prior to measuring a dependent variable. This way you can rule out alternative explanations for causality. What you do in this experiment is you control for all the threats to internal validity due to experiences or environmental factors by systematically manipulating the independent variable while keeping everything else constant. You control for most of the threats due to participant characteristics through random assignment. And this is how you do it. This is the diagram which they give you in figure 8.4. During your reading, if you have read thoroughly enough that you understand figure 8.4, I think you've got everything you need out of this chapter. One way to do that is to do practice 8.3, which is where you design in your own head an experiment, and the answer in the back of the book in Appendix A gives you all of this information here to see if you've actually got a good grasp of that in your head. Basic issues in designing an experiment relate to recruiting participants. You should ask yourself, can you pre-screen for practical and ethical issues? And you have to worry about informed consent as well. Random assignment works in 2 ways. In an independent groups experiment, you use simple random assignment or a stratified random assignment. And in a dependent groups experiment, you can do matched random assignment and random assignment in order of conditions. So this is the table that explains that, table 8.1, random selection to your sample on this side versus random assignment to independent variable condition on the other side. Basic issues in designing an experiment as well ask you to control extraneous variables and confounds as much as possible. This controls for threats to internal validity, and you have to remember that complete control is impossible. Figure 8.5 is interesting because what it illustrates is that you can have 2 different kinds of test populations. In this case here, you can't find a control group where they have 0 sleep. So you would have 2 test populations, one that gets 4 hours of sleep and one that has 8 hours of sleep, and then you would compare those 2 groups. And so you have redesigned the experiment where the control group is actually another experimental group. When you're designing your experiment, you want to be able to manipulate your independent variable, so you want at least two conditions: the experimental group and the control group, or two experimental groups, as I just explained. Types of manipulations can be, as illustrated in that first slide where it explained environmental manipulations, scenario manipulations, instructional manipulations, and physiological manipulations. How to choose your manipulation: you would base it on past research and theory, you would balance the strength of manipulation with ethical and practical issues, and then you would test the manipulation in a pilot test to make sure that it's going to work before you do the full-blown, very expensive, high resource demands experiment. Manipulation can be checked after the experiment is completed on your pilot test. Once you've designed the manipulations for your independent variable, that is when you measure your dependent variable, and you want to choose a measure that is, as we've studied in previous chapters, reliable and valid, and also sensitive to the independent variable manipulation. Practice 8.4 is a good exercise for you. I want you to do that. What 8.4 is asking you to do is to identify which of these variables can and cannot be independent variables in an experiment, and then you have to say why they cannot be. And it has to do with the manipulations. And the answers in the back are very good, and you can go back to Appendix A and check your answers, or just read through this to see if you're able to pick them. And if there's any answer that doesn't make sense, then you need to do a little more thorough reading of this section. Other threats to internal validity come from the Hawthorne effect, which is where the presence of the experimenters themselves became an independent variable. Demand characteristics, which is a situation where you would want a blind experiment to reduce the demand characteristics. Understand that term. And the experimenter expectancy effects is what I've talked about a lot in previous chapters here. As a gay man, on any research that involves marriage equality, I would go into the research with a desired, expected outcome that I want to be able to produce. And I have a personal vested interest in the outcome being favorable to marriage equality. And so a double-blind experiment would reduce this expectancy effect, and the diffusion of the treatment is another threat to internal validity as well. This is an interesting comic which is too complicated for me to explain in depth on the video. I don't want to spend the time, but what I want you to do is when you look at figure 8.6, I want you to read this fine print at the bottom to see if it makes sense. And the cartoon illustrates how this happens, but it's one of those things where you have to sit and think about it before you really get the impact of what it's trying to teach. So I want you to read and focus on this bottom section here to make sure you really get what they're talking about. And you may have to reread some section of the textbook. Practice 8.5 is not a practice exercise I want you to spend any time on for my part. If it's something interesting to you, go ahead, but it's not going to be required. The limitations of experimental design are that experiments focus on internal validity and consequently tend to have lower external validity, so you get more of one at the expense of the other. Some variables cannot or should not be manipulated. That would be an ethical violation. And random assignments to groups is not always feasible. And so just remember, experiments are never perfect. You just mitigate the threats to validity as best you can. And then you have to live with the idea that this is not ideal, but it's more information than you had before. Thank you. That's it for Module 10.